The air inside the shelter was cold and smelled of bleach and sorrow. Calvin Mercer moved slowly down the corridor, his boots echoing over the linoleum floor as a dozen dogs barked for attention behind steel bars. He didn't flinch. At 68, Calvin had faced fires, seen lives end in smoke and chaos, and had buried the love of his life 3 winters ago. Nothing startled him anymore, except maybe the silence that had taken over his house since Eleanor died. "Mr. Mercer?" called a soft voice from behind. It was Jenna Whitlow, the young shelter worker with kind eyes and a clipboard clutched to her chest. "We have a few easier dogs up front. Real gentle types. That one down there," she pointed, lowering her voice. "He's not recommended. History of aggression. We've had issues." But Calvin wasn't listening. His eyes had locked on the last kennel, shadowed and isolated. Inside stood a large German shepherd, rigid, silent, with a coat dark as ashen eyes that didn't bark. They stared, deep, unreadable, and still. Calvin walked closer, slowly crouching in front of the cage. He ignored the paper taped to the bars that read, "Danger, do not approach." He extended a hand through the gap in the gate. Jenna stepped forward quickly. "Sir, please, he's not." But the dog didn't growl, didn't move, just stared. And then, without warning, he stepped forward and placed his paw in Calvin's open palm. Jenna froze. That's the first time he's ever done that." "What's his name?" Calvin asked quietly. "We call him Sarge," she replied. "Short for sergeant. Came in from a case with some kind of military connection. Never confirmed." Calvin stood, not taking his eyes off the dog. "I'll take him." The ride home was quiet. Sarge sat tall in the passenger seat, not restless, just alert. Calvin glanced at him occasionally, studying the dog's body language. Tight, observant, restrained. It was the posture of someone who expected the worst but didn't flinch anymore. When they pulled into the gravel driveway of Calvin's small home on the edge of town, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the pine trees. Inside, the house was still. Calvin placed a thick blanket near the fireplace and a bowl of water beside it. Sarge walked the perimeter of the room like a soldier securing the scene, then lay down across from Calvin's recliner. Neither moved. They just watched each other in silence. But sometime around midnight, Sarge rose and crossed the room. He stood beside the recliner and slowly laid his head on Calvin's knee. The old man stirred, eyes still closed, and let his hand fall naturally onto the dog's head. In that quiet moment, something shifted. What Calvin didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Sarge's story was far from over, and neither was his. The following morning, Calvin rose before dawn, the way he had for most of his adult life, even after retirement. Old habits don't ask permission to stay. The house was quiet, but something was different. For the first time in years, there was movement beyond the creaking floorboards and wind outside. Sarge lay near the front door, body curled tightly, ears alert even in sleep. Calvin stood for a moment just watching him. This creature that barely let anyone touch him at the shelter, now guarding the house like it had always been his duty. Calvin brewed a pot of strong coffee and poured a cup into the faded navy mug Ellie had bought him on their 30th anniversary. It still said "World's Toughest Husband" in chipped gold paint. He sat by the window, sunlight beginning to filter in, and felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not peace exactly, but presence. A sense that he wasn't entirely alone. Sarge eventually got up, stretched, and approached. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't beg. He simply sat beside Calvin and looked out the window, as if waiting for something to come down the long gravel driveway. They took a slow walk through the property later that morning. The dog never pulled on the leash, never barked, just moved like he was trained to follow without question. Calvin noticed the scars beneath the fur, one near the neck, another along his side. Bullet wound, barbed wire, whatever they weren't from playtime in a backyard. Someone had put Sarge through hell, and it wasn't over. Not completely. Later that day, Calvin drove Sarge into town to visit Dr. Valerie Cross, the local vet who had treated his old golden retriever years ago. The clinic was small, warm, filled with quiet country music and the scent of antiseptic. Valerie, now in her late 50s, welcomed him with a kind smile. "You finally decided to let another dog into your life, huh?" she said. "Took you long enough." Calvin smiled faintly and explained where Sarge came from. Valerie ran her hands gently along the dog's spine, checking joints and scars. Then she paused. "Did they tell you about the microchip?" she asked. "No," Calvin replied, surprised. "He's chipped." Valerie nodded. "Yeah, standard procedure for dogs that come through enforcement channels. Might tell us something." She scanned him and the reader beeped. A long string of numbers appeared. She typed them into her computer and waited. The screen froze for a moment, then loaded. Her expression changed. Something flickered in her eyes. Concern, maybe confusion. "Ha!" she said quietly, more to herself than to Calvin. "That's not usual." Calvin leaned forward. "What is it?" Valerie looked up. This chip was registered by a military base, out of state, and it's marked classified access only. Calvin stared at her, then looked down at Sarge, who was now watching him, not the room. It was the first time the dog looked alert in a different way. Not anxious, not calm, but ready. And Calvin realized he hadn't just adopted a dog. He had brought home a story someone didn't want told. Calvin couldn't shake Valerie's words as he drove home. Classified access only. What kind of dog gets a chip connected to a restricted military base? It wasn't just strange, it was unnerving. He glanced at Sarge, who sat as still as ever in the passenger seat, eyes locked on the road ahead. No reaction, no emotion, just the same quiet awareness that felt more human than canine. Calvin had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers returning from war, firefighters after a brutal rescue. It was the look of someone who had survived something they'd never be able to explain. Back at home, Calvin poured himself another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. Dusty, slow, and barely connected to the internet. He typed in the microchip number and got nothing. The registry didn't show anything public. No name, no owner, just a dead link and a message that read, "Access denied. Military clearance required." Calvin leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking beneath him. A dog with a sealed past. The kind of past that leaves scars, silence, and secrets. Sarge lay by the front door again, like a sentry. He hadn't barked once since arriving. Hadn't played, but he never left Calvin's side. That afternoon, when Calvin walked toward the garage to grab some tools, Sarge stood and followed without being called. When Calvin opened the back of the truck to lift a crate, Sarge jumped in before he could even gesture. It was instinctual, like he was trained to protect something, or someone. Calvin stared at him. "Who were you protecting before me?" The next morning, he made a call he hadn't made in over a decade. Silas McCready, an old friend from his firehouse days who had left the department and gone into law enforcement. Silas had always been the kind of man who knew how to find information people didn't want found. They hadn't spoken since Ellie's funeral, but when Calvin heard the familiar gravel in Silas's voice, something in his chest loosened. "McCready," Silas answered. "It's Calvin. I need a favor." Silas didn't hesitate. "Say it." Calvin explained the chip, the shelter, the military link. There was a pause on the other end, and then Silas sighed. "Send me the number. I'll dig. But if this is what I think it is, you might not like what you find." That night, Calvin sat on the porch, Sarge lying at his feet. The wind moved through the trees in slow whispers. Somewhere far off, a train rumbled. Calvin looked down at the dog beside him. Strong, quiet, unwavering. He hadn't just brought Sarge home. He had opened a door that someone had locked for a reason. 2 days passed before Silas called back. Calvin answered on the first ring, his heart already pounding. The silence on the other end lasted longer than expected before Silas finally spoke. "I don't know what you've got there, Cal, but that dog was never meant to end up in a shelter. He was attached to a discontinued program called Echo Red, some kind of military-civilian joint task force. Files are scrubbed clean, but his chip ID matches one of the last entries before the program was shut down. Calvin sat motionless at the kitchen table, coffee cold in his hand. What kind of program? Hard to say, classified to the bone. But from what I can gather, these dogs weren't just used for detection or patrol. They were trained for human tracking, psychological support, and, get this, covert surveillance. Used in certain operations with no official record. That's not a pet you adopted, Cal. That's a soldier. The words didn't sink in right away. He looked over at Sarge, lying near the window, ears twitching at every passing car. Could a dog forget who he was trained to be? Or was he just waiting for orders that would never come? Calvin felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. He hadn't just saved a dog. He had disrupted something far larger than himself. Something that had wanted Sarge buried, forgotten. Later that night, Calvin pulled down the old photo albums Ellie had kept in the hallway closet. As he flipped through pages of family birthdays and camping trips, he found one photo that made his breath hitch. It was from a community event nearly 6 years ago, a veterans fundraiser in the town square. In the background, barely visible, was a group of uniformed men, and standing next to one of them, unmistakably, was Sarge. Same eyes, same scar on the flank. The man beside him had a name tag. Frost. Gideon Frost, Silas confirmed when Calvin called back. Army Ranger. Discharged under sealed circumstances. Disappeared off the grid a few years ago. No current address. No records after 2019. Calvin rubbed his temples. So Sarge belonged to him? Looks that way. And whatever happened between them, it didn't end quietly. After the call, Calvin sat in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sarge lay nearby, head on his paws, unmoving. Calvin looked at him, not as a pet, not even as a companion, but as someone carrying ghosts no one could see. And in that quiet moment, Calvin whispered something he hadn't said aloud in years. "You're not alone anymore." But as the wind rattled the windows, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had just realized Sarge was no longer missing. He was found. It started with small things. The mailbox left open when Calvin was certain he had shut it. Footprints in the dirt driveway that didn't match his boots. A black SUV parked at the corner of the road 2 mornings in a row. Engine off, windows tinted. Sarge noticed before he did, ears standing, body rigid. A low growl forming in his throat like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Calvin stood on the porch in silence, watching the vehicle slowly pull away as if it had just been passing by. But something in his gut told him that wasn't the truth. That night, Calvin sat by the fire again, a habit that had returned as naturally as breathing. Sarge lay at his feet, tail still, body tense. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" Calvin muttered. Sarge didn't move. His eyes remained on the door, on the windows, like he expected someone to come through them. That kind of vigilance didn't fade overnight. Calvin had seen it before, in men who had returned from war but never left it behind. Unable to sleep, Calvin went back to the laptop. He searched Gideon Frost again, this time digging into military forums, private databases, and encrypted blogs Silas had shown him years ago. After an hour, a name came up that hadn't appeared before. Echo Red Handler Alpha. G. Frost. K9 Unit. Sarge. There was an attached phrase in the notes section. Reassigned to Civilian Recovery Code Dusk. Calvin didn't know what Code Dusk meant, but it didn't sound like anything natural. You don't reassign a war dog to a shelter unless someone wants him out of the way. Around 2 a.m., Calvin heard it. 3 sharp taps at the front door. Not loud, not frantic, measured. Sarge shot up and stood in front of the door, teeth bared, body unmoving. Calvin grabbed the revolver from the locked cabinet under the stairs. He hadn't touched it since Ellie died. His hands didn't shake as he stepped into the hallway. Whoever was outside knocked again, softer this time. Then silence. He waited a full minute before opening the door. There was no one there, just the sound of trees moving in the wind and a plain white envelope sitting on the welcome mat. Calvin picked it up slowly, heart pounding. Inside, A single sheet of paper with one sentence, printed in black ink. "You're not supposed to have him." The next morning, Silas called. "Cal, whatever you've gotten into, I think it's starting to move. I had someone ask questions about that chip number. Military guys. Real quiet, real careful. You need to decide if you want to keep going." Calvin looked at Sarge, who now sat beside him, not guarding, but waiting. He had already made his decision. The wind that night was different, colder, heavier, as if the air itself had been warned. Calvin sat on the porch with Sarge beside him, both of them facing the long gravel road that led to the house. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was anticipation. Calvin's hand rested near the old revolver on the table. He didn't want to use it, but after the envelope, after the black SUV, and after Silas's warning, he wasn't taking chances. Just after midnight, the security light above the garage flickered on. Sarge stood up instantly, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the tree line behind the house. Calvin followed his gaze and froze. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the light. No movement, no sound. A silhouette of a man in a coat, tall and still. Calvin stepped forward, gun in hand, heart hammering. "I don't know what you want," he called out, "but I'm not giving him up." The man didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked back into the trees, slow and deliberate. Calvin waited, eyes scanning the shadows, but the figure didn't return. After several minutes, he and Sarge circled the property with a flashlight and found no trace. No prints, no tire tracks, no sense Sarge would follow. It was a message. Someone had come close enough to see how serious Calvin was, and left without confrontation. For now. The next morning, Calvin drove into town to speak to Silas in person. They met behind the old feed store, where no one would hear them. Silas looked 10 years older than the last time Calvin saw him. Gray beard fuller, eyes darker. "I reached out to an old contact in DOD, Silas said. "Unofficially. He told me Frost went rogue near the end. Took Sarge with him after an op that went sideways. They were supposed to be retrieved, but neither came back. Until now." Calvin exhaled. So why would they come after the dog? Because Sarge was trained to remember. Faces, voices, routines, maybe even locations. You don't want a dog like that in civilian hands, especially if he knows things someone wants buried. Back at home, Calvin sat beside Sarge on the porch again, but this time he wasn't thinking about the threat. He was thinking about choice. Sarge had chosen him. Out of everyone at the shelter, a broken old man with nothing left had been the one he trusted. That wasn't coincidence. That was instinct. And maybe, just maybe, Sarge had come back not to hide, but to finish something he started. As the sky turned orange with the fading sun, Sarge suddenly perked up, ears tilting to the side. Car was coming down the driveway. The vehicle rolled in slow, its tires crunching against the gravel like bones beneath boots. Calvin stood, revolver tucked in his waistband, and watched from the porch as the dark sedan pulled up just far enough to block the road, but not close enough to make conversation easy. Sarge stood at his side, muscles taut, eyes locked on the car. It was silent inside. No one stepped out. The windows stayed up, reflecting the trees and sky. Calvin's gut twisted. Whoever was inside wasn't lost. They were testing him. A full minute passed before the passenger window lowered halfway. A man's voice carried out, calm and clipped. "We're looking for the animal. No need for this to get complicated. No name, no badge, just words delivered like instructions." Calvin took one step forward and stopped on the porch's edge. "His name is Sarge, and he's not going anywhere." There was no threat in his voice, only certainty, the kind that made men think twice before pressing forward. The man replied without emotion, "He's classified property. What you've done is technically theft." Calvin almost laughed. "He's not a file folder. He's a dog. A damn loyal one." For the first time, the driver turned his head, just slightly, and Calvin caught the glint of something cold behind the window. Not fear, not hesitation, purpose. "We'll be back," the voice said. The window rolled up. The car reversed slowly, then disappeared down the road the same way it came. It wasn't over. It had just started. Back inside, Calvin sat at the kitchen table and stared at the envelope still tucked into his coat pocket. You're not supposed to have him. The message wasn't just about Sarge, it was about whatever Sarge remembered. Whatever he had seen, whatever he had been trained to respond to. Calvin looked at the dog beside him and spoke softly, like speaking to a friend who'd seen too much. What did they make you do, boy? That night, he locked every door and kept the lights off. Silas called, voice tense. They came by my house too, Cal. Didn't say much. Just wanted to know if I'd talk to you. They're not local. Government types. The kind that don't file reports. You need to be careful. Calvin nodded, though no one could see. I've got no plans to give him up. Silas's voice dropped low. Then you better prepare for what's coming. Outside, the wind howled louder than usual. Sarge sat by the window, staring into the dark like he could hear something the world had forgotten how to notice. Calvin stood behind him, hand resting on his back. For the first time since Sarge arrived, Calvin realized he wasn't just protecting the dog. He was preparing to stand between the past and those trying to erase it. The sound came just before 3 a.m., a faint crack in the distance, followed by the sharp scent of smoke. Calvin bolted upright in his recliner, heart already racing. Sarge was already on his feet, growling low and steady, eyes fixed on the back window. Calvin moved quickly, grabbing his flashlight and gun, and stepped onto the porch. The night was heavy and windless, but the glow behind the tree line told the truth before the smoke even reached his lungs. Someone had set fire to the woods behind the house. Calvin didn't hesitate. He ran to the shed, pulled out the fire hose he hadn't used in years, and started spraying the edge of the property. Sarge stayed close, pacing, alert, never panicking. The fire hadn't reached them yet, but it was deliberate. Calvin could feel it. Controlled, designed to scare him or flush them out. He knew that tactic well. It was what people did when they couldn't force a door open. They burned the house down. By sunrise, the fire was out. The edge of the forest smoldered like a battlefield after retreat. The local fire department arrived hours later, confused. We didn't get any calls, one of them said. Looks like a natural brush fire. Calvin didn't argue. No one local had started this, and no one local had reason to silence a man and his dog. But someone far away clearly did, and they were getting bolder. Inside, Calvin sank into the couch, covered in soot, arms aching. Sarge climbed up beside him, something he hadn't done before. The weight of the dog's body against his was grounding. For a long moment, neither moved. Finally, Calvin whispered, "They want you gone, not because you're dangerous, but because you remember something they can't risk coming back." That same morning, Silas sent a single message, "Frost is alive." Calvin blinked at the screen. Gideon Frost, handler, owner, the man Sarge had once followed. The message included coordinates, rural Montana, off-grid, no official residence. Calvin stared at the numbers, then looked at the map. Frost had vanished for years, but if he was still alive, there was only one person who could unlock the rest of Sarge's past, and maybe explain why the government wanted it buried so badly. Calvin stood and grabbed the bag he hadn't used since Ellie died. Clothes, cash, revolver, notebook. He packed quickly, with the calm of a man who had nothing to lose and one thing to protect. Sarge watched, head tilted, ears alert. "You ready to find out who you really are?" Calvin asked. Sarge didn't bark. He just stood, walked to the door, and waited. They weren't running anymore. They were going to Montana. The Montana air hit colder than Calvin expected. Sharp, dry, and honest, like the kind of place built for disappearing. The road to the coordinates Silas sent wasn't on any GPS. It curved through dense pine forests and ended at a broken wooden gate that looked untouched for years. Beyond it, a small log cabin stood half swallowed by trees and time. No smoke from the chimney, no sound but the wind. But Sarge's ears went up the second they passed through the gate. He knew. Calvin parked, stepped out and scanned the clearing. Sarge stayed close, every muscle in his body tense but controlled. They approached the cabin slowly. Calvin knocked once, then again. Nothing. He reached for the handle, unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dust, silence, and a man sitting in the far corner with a rifle resting across his lap. "That's far enough," the man said, voice low and worn. His beard was thick and gray, his eyes sunken but alert. "You brought him back." "Gideon Frost," Calvin said. It wasn't a question. Frost didn't respond right away. His eyes dropped to Sarge, who had stepped inside, tail still, ears high. They stared at each other like two ghosts reunited. Frost lowered the rifle. "You kept him alive," he said softly. "I didn't think anyone would." Calvin stayed near the doorway. "They said you were dead. They tried to take him back." Frost chuckled dryly. "They don't want him back. They want him gone. Wiped clean." He stood slowly, every joint cracking under weight Calvin couldn't see. Sarge was part of a recon unit meant to observe American operatives suspected of leaking intel. He was trained to track, record, and remember. What they didn't expect was that he'd get too good at it. He remembered everything. Faces, voices, orders. Even the ones never written down. Calvin's stomach turned. "So he's walking evidence." Frost nodded. "We saw something we shouldn't have. A mission gone bad. Orders that weren't legal. I refused to hand him over when they tried to silence the program. We ran. I made sure they thought I died in a fire. But Sarge, he didn't know. He tried to get back to base. That's how they caught him." The cabin fell silent again. Sarge approached Frost slowly, tail low, head bowed. Not out of fear, but memory. Frost kneeled and touched the dog's head. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry I left you, buddy." Calvin stepped forward. "What do we do now?" Frost looked up. "Now? You finish what we started. You get the truth out. They won't stop unless someone forces them into the light." Outside, the wind picked up, and for the first time, Sarge let out a deep, quiet bark, as if agreeing. They had one chapter left, and this time they weren't alone. The town of Iron Lake, Montana, wasn't known for much. A single diner, one post office, and a radio station that played gospel on Sundays. But that week, something unusual happened. A file appeared in the inbox of 4 major news outlets, anonymously submitted, containing military documents, photos, transcripts, and audio files. Embedded among the metadata was a tracking pattern only someone with special clearance would recognize, and embedded in that was the truth. Evidence of covert missions, illegal orders, and the erased existence of a program called Echo Red. Calvin hadn't expected the world to change overnight, but it didn't need to. Frost had provided everything. Sarge's training, his memories, his instincts. All of it led to one purpose: to remember what men in power wanted forgotten. The flash drive was mailed under a fake name, the return address a cabin long since abandoned. Frost disappeared the morning after, left without goodbye. Just a note. "Thank you for giving him what I couldn't." A safe ending. In the weeks that followed, the pressure eased. No more black SUVs. No more letters. No more shadowed threats. Whoever had tried to erase Sarge had backed off. Maybe it was the fear of exposure. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe, deep down, they understood what Sarge had become. Not a weapon, not evidence, but a soul. A survivor. Calvin and Sarge returned home to Oregon. The air smelled sweeter somehow. Not because the danger was gone, but because the weight had been shared. People in town noticed the change. Calvin, once the quiet widower who barely left his porch, now walked Main Street every morning with Sarge beside him. Kids would run up to pet the big dog who once flinched at every sound. And Sarge? He'd let them. His tail wagged now. Not always, but enough. Enough to know the healing had begun. One evening, as the sun melted behind the trees and the porch bathed in gold, Calvin sat with Sarge by his side. He held the old photograph again, the one with Ellie smiling at a picnic. He didn't feel broken anymore, just changed. The kind of change that happens when 2 wounded souls decide not to run, but to stand together. He looked down at Sarge and whispered, "You did good, soldier." Sarge lifted his head, pressed it against Calvin's leg, and closed his eyes. They had both followed orders once. They had both lost everything. But now, in a quiet house at the edge of town, they had found something else. Peace.